Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at trust as a collective good. We're using excerpts from this academic paper. It's called Trust as a Collective Good, Parallels Between Vaccines, Institutions, and Social Stability. So we're going to be kind of exploring why trust is so important for societies to function. And then we'll also get into some of the ways this concept applies in different areas.
Yeah, the paper basically, it puts forward this idea that trust is a lot like a public good. Things like clean air or public infrastructure, they benefit everybody, not just individuals. It's not like you can hoard trust or prevent other people from benefiting from it, right? And so the paper's argument is that maintaining this collective good of trust requires everybody in society to participate.
Okay, so they start by explaining how trust is really fundamental to how civilizations work. It's crucial for personal relationships, it's needed for institutions to run properly, and it's essential for cooperation on a large scale.
And they connect this back to ideas from Enlightenment philosophers, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes. They saw trust as a really important part of the social contract. This idea that individuals agree to give up some freedoms in exchange for security and order and other benefits that come from living in a structured society. And without trust, this whole agreement kind of falls apart.
That's a really important point. So moving on, let's talk about this parallel that the paper draws between trust and
Yeah, exactly. Network effects are about how something becomes more valuable as more people use it. Think of social media. It's more useful the more people are on it. And it's similar with trust. As trust grows in a society, the benefits multiply, which encourages even more people to trust. So you get this positive feedback loop. It leads to better social cohesion and more cooperation.
So the paper goes on to explore how this idea of trust as a collective good applies in a bunch of different areas.
Yeah.
And they start with vaccines and public health.
Yeah, vaccines are a really good example of both collective action and the importance of trust. When someone gets vaccinated, they're not just protecting themselves, they're also protecting others, especially people who can't get vaccinated for medical reasons. And this collective protection really depends on everyone trusting scientific research, trusting medical professionals, and trusting public health institutions.
And when that trust breaks down, we've seen that there can be real consequences.
Absolutely. When people lose trust in vaccines, vaccination rates go down, and that weakens herd immunity. And then societies become more vulnerable to outbreaks of diseases that we could have prevented. So you see these very real consequences, which underline how fragile trust is and how important it is to keep it strong, especially in public health.
And from vaccines, the paper then moves on to the more complex issue of trust in institutions.
Right. They argue that institutions like governments, courts, law enforcement, they all rely on public trust to function effectively. These institutions provide essential services, enforce laws, and maintain order. When people trust these institutions, they're more likely to follow laws, participate in their civic duties, and believe in the fairness and legitimacy of the system.
But what happens when that trust starts to erode?
Well, when trust in institutions declines, you see all sorts of negative consequences. You might see more corruption because people believe there's a lack of accountability and integrity in the system. Inefficiency increases because people become disillusioned and they're less willing to cooperate with institutions that they don't trust. And this decline in trust can also lead to social unrest and instability. People lose faith that the institutions can meet their needs and address their concerns.
And we can see this happening in different parts of the world today, right?
Yeah, definitely. The rise of political polarization in a lot of democracies is a good example of how trust in institutions can erode. This often means people have less trust in the opposing political party, in the electoral process, or even in the media. And this lack of trust can cause gridlock, making it hard for governments to solve important societal issues. It can also create animosity and division between people, further weakening the social fabric.
Now let's shift gears a little and talk about how trust connects to social norms, those unwritten rules that we all follow in our daily lives.
The paper emphasizes that social norms are very much rooted in trust. Norms like honesty, fairness, reciprocity, respecting each other's property, these all rely on the idea that most people will follow them. And this shared understanding is what allows for predictability and cooperation in our day-to-day interactions.
And this idea of reciprocity seems especially relevant here.
Yeah, reciprocity is that expectation that if you treat people fairly and respectfully, they'll do the same in return. It's a basic building block of trust because it encourages people to behave in a pro-social way, knowing that their actions are likely to be reciprocated. So this mutual expectation of fairness actually strengthens social bonds and makes for more harmonious society.
But what are the implications when this fundamental trust starts to crumble?
When trust deteriorates, people become less likely to follow social norms. If someone feels like other people aren't being honest or fair, they might feel less obligated to do so themselves. And this can lead to a decline in ethical behavior. People might be more likely to lie, cheat, or act selfishly. So this erosion of social norms can be really damaging to social cohesion. It leads to more conflict and a feeling of insecurity.
Let's move on to another area where trust is really important: climate change.
Yeah, addressing climate change requires global cooperation on a scale that we haven't seen before. Countries need to trust each other to share resources, to make sacrifices, and to implement policies that benefit everyone, even if it means individual countries might face some costs. This kind of collaboration is simply impossible without a foundation of trust between nations, their leaders, and their people.
And the lack of trust in this context can have serious consequences.
Right.
Without trust in the science of climate change, trust in the proposed solutions, and trust in the commitment of other nations, efforts to mitigate climate change are probably going to fail. Skepticism and misinformation can undermine the implementation of effective policies and technologies that are needed to address this existential threat. So trust is absolutely crucial for getting everyone to work together to face this global challenge.
Finally, the paper takes us to an area where we might not always think about trust, but where it's incredibly important: the economy.
Our economic systems are fundamentally built on trust. Think about our currencies. They have value because we all collectively agree that they do. And this trust extends to financial institutions, markets, and regulatory bodies. We trust banks to protect our money, we trust that investments will be handled responsibly, and we trust that markets will operate fairly and transparently.
And you can see how if trust in this area were to disappear, it would have ripple effects throughout the entire system. History has shown us time and again how devastating it can be when trust in economic systems collapses. Financial crises, which are often caused by a sudden loss of confidence in banks, investment schemes, or the overall stability of the system, can lead to recessions, job losses, and widespread hardship. The 2008 global financial crisis, which was partly caused by a lack of transparency and accountability in the financial industry, serves as a stark reminder of how fragile these systems are and how crucial trust is for them to function properly.
So we've seen how fundamental trust is across a whole range of different aspects of society. But the paper also acknowledges that trust is inherently fragile, and we'll explore that side of trust more in the next part of our deep dive.
As we've seen, trust isn't something that's just there, unbreakable. It can be damaged, and it can be really hard to rebuild once it's lost. The paper talks about this idea of fragility by looking at what are called threshold effects and tipping points.
Okay, can you explain a bit more about those concepts and how they relate to trust?
Sure. So threshold effects are basically about a point where even a small change in a system can trigger a really big shift, a shift that you often can't reverse. And tipping points are similar. They're those critical moments where a system changes rapidly and dramatically. And the paper argues that trust works in a similar way.
Do you have an example of how that might work?
Imagine you have a forest that's been drying out because of a long drought. The threshold effect might be the point where the moisture level in the undergrowth drops below a certain level, making it super easy for a fire to start. Then all you need is a tiny spark, maybe from lightning or something, and suddenly you have a massive wildfire that changes the whole ecosystem. That's the tipping point, that shift from a stable state to something completely different.
So how does this apply to trust?
Just like there's a critical level of moisture needed to prevent a forest fire, there's a tipping point for trust as well. Once trust in a person, an institution, or a system falls below a certain level, it becomes very vulnerable. Even a small event can trigger a huge loss of trust, and then it's extremely difficult to get it back.
This reminds me of the comparison we talked about earlier with herd immunity.
Exactly. Like there's a certain percentage of people who need to be vaccinated to maintain herd immunity. There's a similar point for societal trust. Once trust drops below that critical level, it's really, really hard to rebuild, and the whole social system becomes vulnerable.
Okay, so what are some of the things that can erode trust, that can push it towards that dangerous tipping point?
The paper identifies a few key risks that can erode trust. They are corruption, misinformation, and inequality. Let's start with corruption.
Corruption definitely seems like an obvious one. How does it actually damage trust?
Corruption is basically a betrayal of trust. When people in positions of power use that power for their own benefit or do things that are unethical or illegal, it undermines trust in the institutions and in the people who are supposed to be leading them. It sends the message that the system is rigged, that it's not fair, and that people can't be held accountable.
And this can create a kind of vicious cycle, right?
Absolutely. When trust declines, people become more cynical and less willing to participate in things like voting or community activities. And they might start to believe in conspiracy theories or other stories that further erode trust. It becomes a downward spiral where institutions stop working effectively and society becomes more divided.
Moving on to misinformation. How does the spread of false information damage trust?
These days, with social media and all the online platforms, information spreads so quickly, and that means misinformation is a really big threat to trust. It's so easy for fake stories, manipulated images, and misleading claims to go viral, and that makes it difficult for people to figure out what's true and what's not. It can lead to a lot of distrust in traditional sources of information like the news media, scientists, and government agencies.
And this distrust can be especially harmful in areas where people need accurate information to make good decisions.
Exactly. When people are constantly exposed to conflicting information, it's hard to get everyone on the same page about important issues, like public health or climate change. Misinformation can create doubt and skepticism, and it makes it hard to implement policies that are based on evidence and reason. It creates an environment where people don't trust experts or institutions and instead rely on things they see online that haven't been verified.
The paper also talks about inequality as a major factor that contributes to distrust. How does economic or social inequality impact trust in a society?
When you have huge differences in wealth, opportunity, or access to important things like healthcare and education, it can create resentment and a sense of unfairness. If people feel like the system is rigged against them, that it benefits the wealthy at the expense of everyone else, they're going to have less trust in institutions and those in power. This can break down social cohesion because different groups in society start to feel alienated from each other and from the people who govern them.
So inequality erodes that sense of shared fate and purpose, the idea that everyone is in it together, which is really important for building and maintaining trust.
Right. When people believe that the system is unjust and that their voices don't matter, they start to distrust everything. They might question the legitimacy of institutions, they might think that the rules only favor the elite, and they might stop participating in civic life altogether. And this erosion of trust can create conditions where social unrest is more likely because people lose faith in the system's ability to be fair and provide opportunities for everyone.
So we've identified some of the main things that can damage trust, but now let's focus on how to fix it. What can we do to rebuild trust once it's been broken?
The paper highlights a few core principles for rebuilding trust: transparency, accountability, consistency, and engaging with the community. And these principles work best when they're used together to tackle the complex issue of trust erosion.
Let's go through those one by one. Starting with transparency, how does that help rebuild trust?
Transparency basically means being open and honest in your communication. Institutions and leaders need to be willing to share information freely, to admit when they've made mistakes, and to clearly explain why they made the decisions they do. When people feel like they're being kept in the dark or that information is being hidden from them, it creates suspicion and distrust. Transparency, on the other hand, shows that you're committed to accountability and lets people see what you're doing and why.
This seems particularly important in a time when people are increasingly skeptical of authority.
Absolutely. With so many alternative viewpoints and conspiracy theories out there, transparency is more crucial than ever. By openly sharing information, institutions and leaders can counter misinformation, build credibility, and show that they are genuinely trying to serve the public good.
Okay, moving on to accountability. How does holding individuals and institutions accountable for their actions help to build trust?
Accountability is key to making sure that power is used responsibly and that people who abuse their power are held responsible for their actions. When something goes wrong, there need to be systems in place to investigate what happened, make judgments, and impose appropriate consequences. This demonstrates that no one is above the law and that the system is designed to protect everyone.
It sends a message that bad behavior won't be tolerated and helps to restore people's faith in the system.
Exactly. Accountability discourages future abuses of power and shows a commitment to ethical standards. It shows that institutions are willing to hold themselves and their members accountable, which is a huge step in rebuilding trust.
The paper also mentions consistency as being important for rebuilding trust. Why is that?
Consistency is about being predictable and reliable. Institutions and leaders need to act in ways that match their stated values and principles. That means keeping promises, sticking to established rules, and making decisions that are in line with past actions. When people see consistency, they're more likely to trust that institutions and leaders are trustworthy and dependable.
This predictability helps to create a sense of stability and makes people feel more confident in the system.
Yes, consistency demonstrates integrity and a commitment to fairness. It reduces uncertainty and helps people make informed decisions because they have a reasonable idea of how institutions and leaders will behave. When actions match words and promises are kept, it strengthens trust and encourages people to cooperate.
Finally, the paper talks about the importance of community engagement in rebuilding trust. Why is that so crucial?
Solutions that are imposed from the top down without any input from the people they affect are rarely effective in rebuilding trust. To build real, lasting trust, you need a bottom-up approach that actively involves the community in the process. That means listening to people's concerns, encouraging open dialogue, and working together to find solutions that address the root causes of distrust.
So this kind of participatory approach gives people a sense of ownership and a voice in shaping the institutions and policies that affect their lives.
Exactly. By actively engaging with the community, institutions and leaders show that they value the perspectives and experiences of the people they serve. This collaborative approach can lead to solutions that are more effective and sustainable because they take into account local knowledge and address the specific needs and concerns of the community.
So while the paper shows us how fragile trust can be, it also gives us some ideas about how to repair it.
Yes, by understanding what can erode trust, and by focusing on transparency, accountability, consistency, and community engagement, we can potentially repair the damage and create a stronger foundation for a more trusting and cohesive society. But the paper doesn't stop at the practical aspects of trust. It also explores the philosophical side of trust, looking at it as a fundamental part of the human experience. We'll delve into these philosophical perspectives in the final part of our deep dive.
We've covered a lot of ground talking about how crucial trust is for society and what can cause it to break down. Now let's dive into the philosophical ideas behind trust as presented in the paper.
Yeah, so the paper goes back to Rousseau's idea of the social contract.
Yeah.
They argue that trust is really the basis for a harmonious society. As individuals, we give up some of our freedoms in exchange for security, order, and all the benefits that come with living in a well-structured society. And that's the heart of the social contract.
And this contract relies on the idea that everyone will actually hold up their end of the deal.
Right, exactly. We trust that other people will follow the rules, respect our rights, and do their part for the common good. And it's this mutual trust that allows us to live together peacefully and productively. It creates this sense of shared responsibility for how well society functions.
So the paper isn't just describing this contract, it's also looking at the ethical implications of trust.
Yeah, it argues that trust has a big ethical dimension. It demands accountability, not only from institutions, but also from individuals. And this two-way accountability is essential for a society to be just and trustworthy.
So it's not just about institutions being transparent and accountable. We, as individuals, also have a responsibility to be trustworthy.
Absolutely. The paper stresses that we have a moral obligation to act in ways that build and maintain trust. Being honest, fair, keeping our promises, respecting others, these aren't just nice things to do. They're fundamental ethical principles that a just and trustworthy society is built upon.
The paper also brings up this interesting idea about the role of collective memory and identity in shaping trust.
Right. Philosophers like Paul Ricoeur have talked about how our understanding of the past, our shared history, can really influence how much we trust institutions and individuals in the present. If there have been betrayals, injustices, or corruption in the past, that can stay in the collective memory and make it harder to rebuild trust. So those experiences from the past shape our perceptions and how willing we are to trust.
That suggests that trust isn't just based on what's happening right now, but also on these deep-seated experiences from the past and the stories we tell ourselves about them.
Exactly. Our understanding of history, how we remember and talk about events from the past, how we choose to commemorate or suppress certain things, these all play a role in our attitudes towards trust today. Recognizing this influence of collective memory and identity is crucial for understanding the dynamics of trust in any society.
Which brings us to the concept of forgiveness. How does that fit into all of this?
The paper argues that forgiveness is key for societies to move past breaches of trust and repair relationships. When trust is broken, it often leads to resentment, anger, and a desire for revenge. But if we hold on to these negative feelings, it can prevent reconciliation and make it harder to restore trust. Forgiveness, on the other hand, allows individuals and societies to acknowledge that something wrong happened, learn from it, and start to heal and rebuild.
So it's not just a personal virtue, but something that's important for society as a whole.
Exactly. Forgiveness helps to hold society together and allows people to move on after conflict and mistrust. It doesn't mean we forget or excuse what happened, but rather that we acknowledge it, hold those responsible accountable, and then choose to move forward in a way that promotes healing and reconciliation. And that's vital for restoring trust and building a more just and harmonious society.
This deep dive has really shed light on how crucial and complex trust is. It's not just a practical requirement for a functional society, but a moral and philosophical foundation that shapes our relationships, our institutions, and ultimately our shared future.
That comparison the paper makes between trust and vaccines is really powerful. Just like we need widespread vaccination for vaccines to be effective, we need widespread engagement for trust to work its magic. It's something we all need to work on together, being trustworthy ourselves, demanding accountability from those in power, and having those difficult conversations to address the things that cause distrust.
As we wrap up, the key takeaway is that trust is precious and fragile. We can't take it for granted. It needs our constant attention, care, and protection. In our increasingly complex and interconnected world, where trust often feels strained, it's more important than ever to understand how trust works, what threatens it, and how we can rebuild and strengthen it. The future of our societies really might hinge on our ability to do just that.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.